After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land that I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to the Lebanon, from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea to the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you will be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. This is the word of God.
Thanks be to God. I was reading through some quotes this week, and this one, it was attributed to a lot of different people with a little different variation, but I'm going to go with this variation by Helen Keller. When one door of happiness closes, another opens, but often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one that has been opened for us. I don't know about you, but there have been situations in my life where I tried to stay in a relationship or maybe a job or a certain place where I knew deep down that God was closing that door. Yet all along I was desperately trying to stick my foot in there and trying to prop it open. I wanted so badly to stay in those situations, to stay comfortable versus dealing with the fear of the unknown. Sometimes I try to put a comma where God is trying to put a period. How about you? Will you pray with me? Dear God, I just ask you to just open up these scriptures and thank you for allowing me to speak to your people and just lead me. Amen. So today we're going to start a new sermon series. And the sermon series is named, We Can't Stay Here. I don't know about you, but there have been times in my life that I just wanted to turn off the clock. You know, sometimes it was because it was a beautiful, lovely, comfortable time, maybe sitting on a wonderful beach, being on vacation. I really loved when my kids were in first grade. First grade was one of my favorite ages. You know, they were good travelers. They could do all the important stuff all by themselves, and they could read. It was just fun, and life was good. But strangely enough, there were also times that were not so great, and yet I wanted to stop the world then too. I was comfortable in the misery that I had, and I knew that I was not ready for any change. I was fearful about what would come next. You know, the misery you know is much better than that possibility of the unknown and how much effort it would take to get to the next place. I don't think I'm alone in that, and so for the next few weeks, we'll be looking at how the people of Israel moved from roaming around in the desert to coming into the promised land. and inhabiting the promises of God. So this morning I'm going to begin with a really fast recap of the story of the people of Israel. And Barry's going to give me a little hand here. Okay, so quick recap. The Israelites were God's chosen people. And what happens is they find themselves slaves in Egypt. But what God does in response to this is he raises up a leader, Moses. And Moses has a mission, and his mission is to free them from slavery and bring them into the promised land. Now, I don't know about you, but, if I think of the promised land, I go, okay, if you are going to get me to the promised land, whatever that might be, the Caribbean or whatever, I'll do whatever it takes to get there. But no, not the Israelites. They wanted concierge first-class service to get them to the promised land. And that is not what God promised them. So, what we have to do is think about it. Is it just the Israelites? Or do we do the same sometimes? God has a plan. We kind of know that, but we're like, oh, we want the easy peasy way to get there, right? We don't want the challenges. We don't want the hassles. And probably, I know for myself, the biggest challenge is trust. What about you? Can I trust the method in which God is going to do this? Sometimes I want to do it my own way. Well, I've realized I am not alone in that. You see, Moses, he got to the place where right there, over the river, was the promised land. And so what he does is he sends out spies and he tells them to find out the condition of the promised land. And so the group comes back. And the group has sort of mixed reports on the promised land. Now, Joshua and Caleb, they come back and they're like, this place is awesome. It is good. It is actually what God has provided for us. I guess a land flowing in milk and honey is something really cool for them. I would say a land flowing in Haagen-Dazs, but that's kind of milk and honey, right? And so they're saying, don't rebel against God. Don't be afraid. Let's do this. But the others, what did they say? No, no, no. No, because there's giants in that land. No, we can't trust that God's going to do this the way we expect. So what ends up happening is because of their lack of trust, they fail to enter the promised land. And God who had repeatedly shown them miracles, given them direction, they didn't trust, and so they begin heading in circles. So not trusting. There's a lot of reasons why we don't rely on God fully. We might think that God is taking too long. Anyone feel like that? Sometimes God's taking too long. Or that God's not paying attention. Sometimes we think that God needs a little help, right? Well, the Israelites, they had exactly the same problem. And they didn't necessarily rely completely on God, and they complained about everything. They were like having teenagers in the car too long. And so it kind of was grating on Moses, but it didn't grate on God. You see, God remained faithful. But what ended up happening is because of their lack of trust, because of their lack of belief, they were wandering around the desert for 40 years. And it wasn't just the people who were messing up. It was the leadership too. They were getting things wrong kind of left and right. There was an incident when Israel was just complaining and they wanted water. And so God told Moses to speak to a rock and water would come forth. But what ended up happening is Moses decided to do it his own way instead of God's way. And so he begins with kind of yelling at the Israelites and telling them things that God had not asked him to say. And then he acted as if God needed him to get the water out of that rock. And so what he does is he strikes it twice. It was a failure of trust and belief on Moses' part. You know, there are times when we too fail to trust God. We fail to have the belief. We fail to follow God's direction. And what happens is we end up facing consequences. For Moses, the consequence of his unbelief was that he didn't get to cross over into the promised land. Just like all the other elders who had come into the desert. You see, because of their unbelief, because they couldn't trust in God's provision, because they were unwilling to see that God was there with them, they lost that blessing. Now, it doesn't mean that God didn't love them. It doesn't mean that God didn't value Moses' service. But it means that it's a lesson for those of us in leadership that we have to trust God. And that is exactly what God requires of us. So what ends up happening is time passes, and all those who came into the desert as adults, they all pass away. And Caleb and Joshua are left. And now, 40 years later, the moment has come for them to once again take that step of faith and go into the promised land. But because Moses can't go, he needs to pass that leadership on to someone else. Now, can you just imagine for a moment the only leader you have ever had, 40 years in the desert. It's, not quite as long as the Queen Mother, but it's a long time. It was going to be like if Gerald Ford was still president. I kind of looked that up. So, Moses needs to kind of put Joshua into place. He needs to tell the people that Joshua is the leader that will take them. How about you? Do you listen to God when God asks you to encourage new leadership or new roles? Are you willing to share the things that God has given you to do to make sure that we pass them on, or are we fearful? So Moses, what he did is he set for all of us a wonderful example of passing on the mantle of leadership to the next generation. You know, it is really tough to pass on a job, but leaders sometimes let that kind of catch them up, because leaders love to lead. They love to serve. They know what they're doing, and they're probably really good at what they're doing. But at the same time, transition is absolutely essential. You see, Moses is going to die at some point, and if they don't have a new leader, what's going to happen? We need to look at that in our own lives, too. Doing transitions well is not very easy. But this book of Joshua gives us such wonderful direction. Although Joshua was mentored by Moses, it doesn't mean his leadership style is going to be the same. Their personalities are not the same. Often when we come to a place when we need to pass on our leadership, we get a little stubborn. And we want the person to do it exactly like we did, right? We want them to replace us as if they are just mirroring us. The truth is that God often selects someone quite different to be our successors so that they can build up new traits in us. Moses supported God's choice both publicly and privately. You see, privately, he strengthened Joshua, his successor. He strengthened him and prayed for him and gave him the tools that he needed. And then, with all of Israel watching, he prays for him and he passes on the mantle. He says, "Be strong and courageous. You will enter this land with this people, and this land God promised their ancestors. You will make them proud possessors of it. God is striding ahead of you. You right there with you. He won't let you down. He won't leave you. Don't be intimidated and don't worry." What a wonderful promise to be given. You know, in my research in trying to look at what Moses did with Joshua, I found this new word. And this is a real word, because I know some of you know I make up a lot of words. But this one is a real one. And it is called generativity. It's hard to say, but it's generativity. And what it is the motivation or the capacity to emotionally invest in the strengths and the development of others. It is essentially that each and every leader, and I am speaking to each and every leader specifically in this church, that you would be willing to empower and encourage others to do what you are doing currently. And remember that they might do it completely different. Generativity in the church meant that we are creating conditions where others can see the love of God, that we can see it in a new way. You know, I've always been impressed by the people who built so many of these small churches in our area. You know, at that time, they didn't have 100 or 200 people coming to church every Sunday. And yet, they had a vision. They had a vision to empower the next generation. That they had a vision that the church would grow. And because of their generosity, we have had this building to use for generation after generation. I'm sure that it wasn't simple to build this church. I'm sure that they needed to make a number of sacrifices. I am sure that what they put into this church, that meant that their homes and their lives would be less luxurious. I have to question and ask, how have we sacrificed for the generations to come? I have to ask, am I providing plans and resources for that next generation so that they will have all they need to carry out God's will for their lives? You see, if we use up everything, if we use everything for our own self and our own pleasure, what are we leaving for our children and our children's children and their children? I know we need to think of that on a global scale, but for today, I want to just keep it really close in this space. What are we building into our today that is not serving us today? Am I surrounding the next generation with people who will encourage them and carry out God's will for their lives? Generativity, I believe, was something that we didn't know that was what it called, but that's what we did as a church 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago, we had 3 high school boys, 3 completely different high school boys, but they were the only teenagers in this church. And yet we hired a 28-year-old mother of 2 babies, and we said, we want to have a youth group. We want to inspire and encourage these kids. We gathered a couple more kids as we went along, but eventually it was because of these 3 kids that we moved into the wine cellar, where we had more than 50 young adults in which we poured into their lives. And I would be surprised if there is even one of those that between Jill and myself that we're not still in contact with today. And so I need to challenge us today. How are we encouraging the teens that are in our church? Are we offering them the same opportunities as we offered 10 years ago? How are we doing with Carly and Nicole and Allie and George and William? How are we doing with AJ and Anna and Eternity and Nora and James and Tim and Sean? And I'm not answering that, I'm just letting that kind of seep down. Do we use our prayers and our presence to bless them and to witness them? And do we use our finances to encourage them and give them what they need? You know, in the past, Big is just an amazing, extravagant gift of love that Mary talked about, the food, and it is just a time in which we just love up the kids in our community. It's on Wednesday afternoons. We walk over to the school, a bunch of us, and then we walk back with this gaggle of kids, and we use that time to play with them, to feed them, to listen to them, and to encourage them. We pray for them, and even though each week nearly kills us, absolutely, we know that we have made bonds stronger each and every week. And pretty soon, those kids call this place their church. And so as we travel through this series, I want us to look at how God leads Joshua and the Israelites. I want us to see the importance of trust in the promise that God gave them. And I need us to continue to see the promise of trust that God gave us. God said in the beginning of my ministry, and we believed and heard the same thing, was if you're willing to sacrifice everything, and we meant everything in our bank account too. If you are willing to sacrifice everything, then together we will build a strong ministry. We will also need to see something larger than Joshua could ever imagine if we are willing to trust. I believe that God is leading us, Simply Grace, to something bigger than any of us can ever imagine. But that means that we cannot be in maintenance mode. I know it has been a really hard summer. People have been sick, people have died, people have moved, and we have been through a lot of turmoil in our family lives. But we need to be willing to leave this life for the life that is possible. And I hope that it isn't just me and Caleb that are making Joshua and Caleb that are crossing over alone. I hope that we go together.